Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second annual GWIU Undergraduate Research Exchange Conference. Well, many know me and many of you I know, but my name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. Last year, for our inaugural conference, IU students and faculty visited GW, and we had a great conference there. This year, GW students were supposed to visit IU in late March. Although we were not able to host you all in person, I'm glad that we are holding this online conference to showcase our students' research that they worked so hard on during this year. We will continue to host this exchange program so that we can provide crucial research experience for our undergraduate students. Let me introduce our IU faculty, staff, and students. Dr. Agnes Jordan, wave your hand, Agnes, who served as the Korea Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow affiliated with IKS this year, has worked with our students to guide them in their research. Faculty mentors who provided topic-related guidance are Dr. John Finch and Dr. Sida Balseji. Ambassador Mark Minton was also who also served as a faculty mentor, is able to join us today. I would like to introduce Dr. Russell Burge. Where are you? Yeah. A modern Korean historian who will join the faculty at IU in fall 2021. And Chaewon Lee, where is Chaewon? Okay, yeah. Who was a GWIU Undergraduate Research Exchange Fellow last year and continuing at IU as a master's student in the fall. And lastly, not least, I would like to thank Keith Seidel, assistant IKS, who worked hard to make this online conference possible. The students who will present today are Toby Huder, a sophomore, Toby, a sophomore majoring in East Asian Languages and Cultures, Summer Snyder, a sophomore majoring in Political Science and East Asian Languages and Cultures, Caitlin Ranieri, a junior majoring in East Asian Languages and Cultures and International Studies, Kelly Rose, just graduated with a major in East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Ivan Thomason, who is not here yet, also just graduated with a double major in Biochemistry and East Asian Languages and Cultures. Let me now turn to Professor Jisoo Kim at GW.
All right, thank you, Seung-Kyung. Hello, everyone. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and also Korean Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce our faculty, staff, and students. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that it's unfortunate that we were not able to visit IU this year.
No.
We were really looking forward to it. We were also not just a conference, but also, concerts that we were planning to go and just everything, right? I don't know how you would like to do, Seung-Kyung, for next year. If things are possible, we may visit there, or you guys can come to GW. I don't know. I guess we would have to decide that, later. But anyways, I would like to thank our students and faculty for working so hard throughout the year. We thought that it was really a pity for not doing anything and just, submitting undergrad students' papers and not do anything was just a pity because they worked so hard throughout the year. So Seung-Kyung and I, we thought we should at least have this virtual conference for our undergraduate students who worked so hard. So once again, I would like to thank all undergrad students, faculty at IU, as well as at GW. So let me introduce our faculty, staff, and students. I would like, Well, I think I'll just introduce those of us who are here, starting with Professor Richard Grinker, who is who's a professor in anthropology, Professor Emmanuel Kim, who's also, well, let me get exact title, Korea Foundation, Kim Renault, Associate Professor of Korean Literature and Culture Studies, right, Emmanuel, if I didn't get that wrong, and Professor Celeste Arrington, Korea Foundation Assistant Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, Professor Myo Park, Assistant Professor of Korean Linguistics and Language and East Asian Languages and Literatures Department, and Professor In Sung Ko, Teaching Assistant Professor in Korean Language and East Asian Languages and Literatures, and our Yeono Kim, who's Associate Director and Associate Research Professor in the Hallyu School. So, and although she's not here with us, I would like to also mention Dr. Sunhae Kim, who was our postdoctoral fellow this academic year, and she's the one who actually led the undergraduate research workshops and really helped our students write great papers. And of course, in addition to that, our faculty members also provided advice as well. So although she's not here, I'd like to thank Dr. Sunhae Kim. Well, she's in Korea right now because she got a new position at Ewha Women's University in Women's and Gender Studies. Well, she's also a student of Professor Seung-kyung Kim. All right, now let me introduce our students. So we had, this year we had 10 undergraduate research fellows in our program. And among those 10 students, we selected 5 top papers, and those students are here with us today, starting with Shea Savage. She's a senior, and she's her major is in political science, and she has a she's doing a double minor in history and classical studies. And Yu-Chun Dai, although she's not here with us, she will give her like a presentation through her video. Yu-Chun Dai is a sophomore in international affairs, concentrating in East Asian history and regional issues. And Mark Thomas Patterson, he's a sophomore in international affairs, concentrating in international politics and Europe and Eurasian studies. Jennifer Shea, who's a sophomore majoring political science and minoring in criminal justice and public policy. And finally, but not least, Sarah Moon, who's a senior, double majoring Japanese and international affairs with a concentration in security policy. All right, then without further, well, I think Professor Greg Brzezinski just joined us. He is a professor of history and international affairs. All right, then I think without further ado, we would like to begin our presentation with, I guess, our first on the list is Toby Huter. Is that it?
Yes,
right?
That's
Oh, sorry. Well, I would also like to thank, sorry, Mine, I forgot to mention your name, our wonderful staff, Mine, who without her, nothing would have been possible. No undergraduate research fellows program or workshops, everything. So fine, I would like to gratefully, thank Mine so much for supporting all of our programs. Thank you. All right, then without further ado, let's begin with Toby.
okay. So hello, my name's Toby Huter, and I'm a sophomore at Indiana University, majoring in East Asian language and culture. And the title of my project was The Transformational Effects of Hallyu on Korean History. The reason I got interested in this project was this summer while I was studying at Yonsei University, I invited my friend Mina, who is studying in Korea to be a hanbok or traditional Korean clothing designer, to go to Gyeongbokgung, the main palace in Seoul, and wear hanbok with me. And while we were at the store to rent our hanbok, Mina was touching a part of one of the hanbok skirts and said that she'd never seen it before. And I was really surprised because she's studying to be a hanbok designer. But when she saw Mina touching the cloth, one of the employees told her to stop in Chinese. And Mina's Korean, so she kind of looked at her, and the employee repeated herself in English. And Mina later told me that none of the people in the store were actually Korean, and it was only really foreigners that come and do this, and it was her first time as well, Mina's first time. So this experience really got me interested, in that Mina had never seen that piece of cloth before because it was not traditionally used, and it just made the skirts more appealing. And so these hanbok were really not authentic, which the store was saying that they were. And two, the store and the people that were in the store were not Korean. It was mostly foreign tourists from China, Korea, or China, Japan, and the United States who were trying on this Korean traditional clothing and going to these traditional locations. So for my project today, I'm going to walk you through my methodology as well as my goals for the project, and then I'm going to introduce my case study that I used, as well as give you my own analysis on the topic and the takeaways I got from the project. So I'm asking mostly in this project, how does increased attention on Hallyu affect how South Korea displays its history? And I'm proposing as a solution that Hallyu, specifically historical Korean dramas, in the last 20 years mostly, have really gone around the globe. And that phenomenon has allowed for the remaking of certain locations to make them more beautified and give a better image of Korea to tourists who are coming in response to Hallyu. And that in turn has led to the hanbok rental industry, which has really given a hands-on experience for tourists coming in to see the Korean culture that they witness on their screens. So why I thought this project was important, because most of the historical literature that is given in these at these specific locations, such as Gyeongbokgung, Bukchon, different locations showing Korean history, there's a lot of history that's cut out, mostly because it gives a worse image of Korea than wants to be displayed. And this causes a lot of missed lessons, such as government control might lead to deterioration of a historical location. And that kind of lesson is missed out, and there's not really anything that has gotten out of the history. This also causes a social phenomenon of selling the image, not necessarily the history. As a lot of historical tourism, the goal is mostly on the aesthetic and taking beautiful images and things like that, versus actual historical education and learning about the historical events that happened in these locations. My methodology was that I sent out a series of interviews to 9 hanbok rental stores. These were the 3 that gave me the most responses, and asked them some demographic information, where they were, how many stores were around them, what kind of people came to their stores, those kinds of questions. And then I also analyzed these 2 different theme parks, which focused on Hallyu, specifically the sections of them that have drama tourism, specifically historical drama tourism, like Daejeongun Theme Park and Embassy World, because I wanted to focus on the Hallyu aspect of bringing tourists into Korea. These were the answers that I received from my interviews. I want to specifically call your attention to the Korean tourists versus foreign tourists and what kind of hanbok they traditionally or usually rent when they visit these stores. And as you can see, foreigners have a tendency to get the more traditional hanbok, and both of these stores that said that foreigners were traditional specifically said that they had palace style traditional hanbok, while Korean people prefer the more hybrid, flashy, more modern hanbok. And this again shows the traditional hanbok is the entrance for most foreigners into Korean culture. By seeing these beautiful images they see in historical dramas, that is what they wish to imitate when they go visit the palaces. And I also want to look at the employee nationality. I thought it was interesting that all of their employees, they said, spoke at least English and Korean, if not Japanese, Chinese, and a variety of other languages. And the more languages they said, the better, to focus on more an increase of all these tourists coming to Korea in the past 20 years. And I also wanted to give you a brief visual of the more traditional hanbok versus the ones that are traditionally rented by foreign tourists. On the left, you can see these very flashy, attractive, very colorful hanbok, very pretty to take a picture in, fun to wear with friends. Whereas on the right side, Mina showed me these, and she said that these were the right stitching, the right coloring, the right fabric that was specific to be used during the different time periods. And as you can see, they're kind of less colorful, less exotic, more mellow, more realistic. And that's just a good visual to show you the difference. Now I'm going to introduce you to my case study. So a brief history of Bukchon is that it was only really seen in official records in 1777, and it was used then as a home of the Yangban class, or the upper class in Korean history. And that was mostly because it was really close to both of the palaces in Seoul, so it gave them easy access to be noblemen in the king's court. But then during Japanese occupation, these huge Yangban houses were downsized and sold to the general public, still in the aesthetic of like the hanok, or traditional style Korean houses. But after occupation, there was lots of government regulations to protect these hanok. They said that you could not manipulate it in any way, and it was to stay exactly how it was. There was a huge boom that was going on with real estate at the time in Korea. So many landowners did not want these houses because they couldn't manipulate them in any way. And so then they fell into disrepair over that 20 or 40-year period. But then in 1995 until the present, there's been an effort to renovate these houses. And now the government has lessened a lot of these regulations, allowing for more manipulation of these houses, although there are like tax benefits and different financial stipends you can receive if you maintain the original aesthetic. Something interesting about this, though, is that this section, the government regulations, is usually left out of tourist literature in Bukchon. It doesn't really show the government in very positive light, and therefore it's left out. And the literature usually implies that these houses are original and they've been there since the time of Joseon. And some even go as far as to say that the descendants of the Yangban class are actually the people that are still living in these houses, which is definitely not necessarily true. In this style of tourist literature, in particularly, is relying on the ignorance of visitors to sell their point. Like, because these houses look authentic and they still look like the image that is being shown of Korean history, they are therefore authentic in the minds of the visitors as well as the general public. And this is focusing on the general appearance and physical appearance that shows that it's not really an authentic building, but it looks like it should be, so therefore it is. So some of my analysis for this is the opportunity to use soft power. As Korea has really not been a super significant military might on a global scale, this is really the opportunity that Korea has had to globalize. It has, the dramas specifically have allowed for the spread of Korean culture across the world, and this gives a lot more opportunity and pressure on these drama industries to give a beautiful image, which then turns into the beautified version of Korean history displayed at tourist locations. But then this is also the creation of place, which is picking and choosing the past that wants to be displayed, that necessarily is not is more of the beautiful images of it, less than the parts that can actually have lessons taken out of them. And these places have been perfected for drama tourists, so it reflects directly the image that is seen on the television and not necessarily what it has always been, which it tells you in the historic literature. So it's particularly the image that is sold, not the history. Takeaways from this project was that because of the rise of Hallyu and all these different tourists from all over the world coming into Korea, it's really put a spotlight on the country, particularly its pop culture. And that has really amped up the pressure on these drama industries to give this beautiful image, but only focusing on the aesthetic, not as much on the history. And this has caused a distortion of history that is not really that beneficial. It's beautiful, it's fun to look at, but it's not necessarily what needs to be taken out of mistakes that have been made in the past. And that is all my presentation. Are there any questions?
We'll go to the second presentation and then do a Q&A together.
Okay. Okay, does that look all right? Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone. My name is Shea Savage. I'm a senior at the George Washington University, majoring in political science. And today I'll be presenting to you about my research on depictions of mass protest in South Korean cinema. South Korea has a rich history of mass protest from the Donghak Rebellion up through the 20th and the 21st centuries. It also has a vivid and burgeoning cinema industry, whose popularity is growing by the year. While scholars have discussed Korea's relationship with political protest, as well as, of course, Korea's relationship with the cinema industry, I sought to really marry those two factors together in my research, which seeks to understand how modern Korean society views protest as a means of political participation through the lens of an analysis of film. In other words, why do people protest if protesting could cost life, limb, and livelihood? I found that Korean cinema forwards three main answers to this question. First, that people protest because of diverging senses of patriotism. Second, that they protest in order to seek justice. And third, that they protest as part of a quest for truth. Here's a brief outline of my presentation. I'll be touching on all three themes in greater depth later on, but I will begin with a very quick historical background overview. The 5 films that I selected for analysis all depict, in some manner, the period of political protest that took place in South Korea during the 1980s. These protests took place under the presidency of Chun Doo-hwan, who was military dictator of South Korea from 1980 until 1987. Chun presided over a period of massive economic expansion, now known by economists as the Miracle on the Han River. However, he also engaged in broad and severe repression, often justified in the name of national security concerns about threats that usually originated from the north. Chun's dictatorship spurred 2 major periods of political protest that I want to talk about for this project. The first mass protest movement that I want to discuss is known as the Gwangju Uprising and Massacre, and it is pictured in the middle of the screen here. It began on May 18th, 1980, in response to Chun's declaration of martial law and the closing of universities in Gwangju. It's remembered by some scholars today as Korea's Tiananmen Square, as heavily armed riot squads fired into crowds of civilians. In the end, over 200 people died during the Gwangju massacre, including about 150 civilians. This event was covered up by the Chun government, and many Koreans were not even aware that it had happened until many years later, due to the repression of news coming out of Gwangju during this period. The second period of mass protest that I want to discuss is now known as the June Struggle of 1987. This was a response largely to the death of Seoul National University student Park Jung-chol, who was tortured to death by police. At the protest's peak, approximately 1 million people took to the streets throughout Korea, demanding justice and an end to the dictatorship. After Yonsei University student Lee Han-yol was struck in the head with a tear gas canister and passed away, as depicted in this famous image on the right of the screen, more fuel was added to the fire. In the end, Chun agreed to implement a system of direct elections, laying the foundations for Korea's eventual future democratization. For my research, I selected 5 films to analyze. Their titles are here on the screen if you would like to read them. These films were chosen from different genres, from police procedural to historical drama to character-driven tragedy, in an attempt to broadly assess Korean cinema's answer to the question, why protest? My research was somewhat limited by the scope of this project, and future research involving a greater number of films would be an interesting undertaking for the future. Korean cinema's first answer to the question, why protest, is related to the theme of patriotism. These films argue that people choose to protest because of diverging answers to the question, what is patriotism? This divergence is captured in 4 out of the 5 films that I watched through the use of 2 main stock characters. The first stock character is the protester, who's usually a young student. He's often male, he's often handsome and kind and likable. The protester is either tortured or killed over the course of the film as a result of their dissent. The second stock character I termed the government official. He serves as the protester's foil. He's often a military man, usually in his middle age, who espouses the vocabulary of political sacrifice and patriotism, as well as anti-communism, while committing acts of violence against the weak and unarmed. Scholar Lee Ai-ri calls the divide captured between these 2 characters the authoritarian-libertarian value change. In this paradigm, it's not anything to do really with the authoritarianism and libertarianism usually used in American discourse. It just means that the authoritarian believes that patriotism is upholding existing power structures, while the libertarian believes that patriotism is actually breaking those structures down and building new and better ones. As I mentioned, these stock characters were employed in some manner in 4 out of the 5 films that I watched. One key example of their use is in 1987, When the Day Comes, which casts the real-life individuals Pak Jong-chol and Lee Han-yeol, who I mentioned before, into the protester archetype. They're depicted at the bottom of the screen, and the government official, who's their foil, is depicted at the top. Patriotism is not the only reason Korean cinema argues that people choose to protest, though. They also protest as a means of seeking justice, in both a legal and a moral sense of the word. This argument alluded to here is that dictatorship actually requires injustice fundamentally, like built into its foundations. This is captured in all 5 of the films that I analyzed via the motif of state-imposed torture, particularly torture used by police or military officials against the innocent. Because those who are tortured in these films have not actually committed any crimes, their suffering is meaningless and will not result in the punishment of wrongdoing. Instead, it only serves to obscure and obfuscate, propping up the dictator while failing to actually achieve anything. In Memories of Murder, one of the films that I watched, 2 police officers fail to catch a serial killer, which results in the elongation of his killing spree and the continued murder of women. This scholar, Christina Klein, claims is the surface versus the deep crime of the film. The surface crime, which the detectives strive to solve, is the serial murders. However, the deep crime is the dictatorship itself, which directs its resources to putting down protest and hushing up dissent instead of protecting its own citizens from death. Director Bong Joon-ho explained in an interview that the detectives don't fail to solve the crimes because of their own incompetence. Rather, they fail because in Korea, quote, there was an incompetence and crudeness in the very ideals of the 1980s, and this is what drove people to dissent. Finally, these films demonstrate that protest is centrally motivated by the desire to uncover and disseminate the truth. Quips and one-liners about truth are incredibly popular and feature prominently in the dialogue of the 5 films that I analyzed. This theme is also highlighted in 3 of the 5 films by a focus on journalist characters who serve in an often dangerous role as a conduit between the public and the truth. As I mentioned before, a lack of truth and transparency allowed the dictatorship to survive and even flourish in the aftermath of the Gwangju massacre. Thus, A Taxi Driver, which takes place in Gwangju during the upheaval, elevates as heroism the actions of those who risked their lives in order to tell the truth about what they were experiencing. And in The Attorney, the lies of the government convert the film's main character from someone who's initially dismissive of the protesters into a protester himself. He boldly declares to the government official stock character that the state, quote, cannot hide the truth forever. This theme is often expressed visually through choices made in cinematography and editing. For example, in A Taxi Driver, the majority of violence that takes place during the film is covered by a cloud of smoke and dust, and is often committed by shadowy men with their faces obscured by gas masks. Thanks to this obscurity, cruelty and violence are allowed to take root. Conversely, in the final shot of 1987, When the Day Comes, we see sun dawning over a crowd of protesters on the streets of Seoul. In the bright light of day, the crimes of the dictator have been exposed and his reign is finally coming to an end. Why study depictions of protest in cinema? I believe that this is important not only to understand the films themselves, but because film has a unique ability to reflect cultural anxieties, beliefs, and values. And Korean political culture remains steeped in mass protest. The photo on the screen is not from a movie, but from the 2016 Candlelight Movement to oust President Park Geun-hye. Films not only serve as a secondary source for the past, but as a primary source for the present, helping us to understand how modern Korean citizens might answer the question themselves, why protest? And I believe that their answer is captured nowhere better than in this quote from A Taxi Driver. Why protest? Because we would rather die standing than live on our knees. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we can entertain probably 1 or 2 questions for each student. And we're gonna make it very succinct and cut it into just 10 minutes. Okay, anybody?
Can we just jump in, or should we?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Just very quickly, I want to say first of all how impressed I am with these presentations and abstracts which I've been reading through, and the very professional way in which you guys are conducting this all through Zoom. My question is for Toby, which is I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was curious to hear you unpack a little bit how you conceive of the kind of specific image that's being constructed of the Joseon period in this media, and also to hear you talk a little bit about sort of what history you feel is being left out and you maybe think should be injected more into these spaces.
So for what image I think is being displayed, is that what your question is? Like of the Joseon dynasty?
Yeah, I think you alluded to some of the characteristics, like it's a kind of nostalgic or dehistoricized image, but I was curious, since you've spent so much time in these spaces and speaking to these people, to hear you elaborate a little bit more on kind of what you think what sort of narrative is being presented.
Personally, I feel like it's a lot of a, it's almost a nationalist kind of image that's being shown. I talked to some of the Hanbok rental stores as well as some of my friends in Korea, and they said that it was kind of the pride of Korea, that people, like, they're very excited when people come and see these things. So the image that they're showing is very much this is the beauty of our home and our country, versus like these are the mistakes that we've made, which is not necessarily unique to Korea, but it's definitely very highlighted in the romanticized image that's being shown. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Celeste?
My question is for Toby also, but I want to echo Russell in saying excellent presentations to both of you. And I'm curious to know, Toby, what you think is new about this remaking of locations. So for example, the Parthenon in Athens is really reconstructed to show the 5th and 4th century sort of democratic period of Athens, not any other specific time period. And it seems like maybe the Park Chung-hee administration also reconstructed palaces to beautify and preserve a particular time period. And so what is it that's new about the drama, the historical drama remaking that you are observing here? And a follow on to that is, to what extent the ROK government is funding a particular image of Korean history, whether there's support for particular films from a time period, whether it's from the government or from industry.
Yeah, so I actually looked a lot at some of the Park Chung-hee administration with the things that he also remade that were kind of to spark nationalism, and I like showing like this is the glory of Joseon and this is what we should work towards. So that was definitely a thing during his administration. But I think that the newer version now focuses a lot more on foreigners, because I kind of thought a little bit about the difference between Gyeongbokgung and Bukchon, whereas Gyeongbokgung is very much was kind of remade because of nationalism and because of nationalist sentiment and wanting to build back up that glory after the Japanese occupation, whereas Bukchon is more of a kind of just an aesthetic location to take pictures, and more of a the beauty of palace life, kind of an authentic or exotic thing that they want to show to other countries. And so it's more of a, here's the glory that we have that was something from the past, and then here is something that we want other countries to see us as, like a strong presence in culturally as well as other things. And that's kind of with the soft power. That's kind of what I think is new about it.
Okay, any questions for Shea?
Hi, I have a question for Shea. Thank you, first of all, for wonderful presentations, both of you. You guys did a wonderful job. For Shea, I wanted to ask this question. So you said that patriotism, truth, and justice are the kind of motives that sort of drive this, like, people to have protests in Korea. I was just wondering, do you think that they are like the Korea-specific kind of motives, or is it more of a universal kind of motive that people could have protests all over the world? If it's a Korea-specific kind of motive, so why do you think that those are the motives that people that drive people to have protests in Korea only?
Thank you for your question. I really appreciate it. I do think that you're probably onto something. That my guess is, to some extent, this is true everywhere, especially in every country that has the kind of like rich history of political protest that Korea does. I think the one thing that is so Korea specific is just how much public protest plays into Koreans' ways that they participate with their government. So for example, here in America, while we do engage in political protest, we don't engage in the kind of extended, long-term political protest that Koreans still engage in today. We often do like one-off, very large demonstrations and then kind of stop. So I think that there's something there that really drives a sort of extension of that protest for long-term engagement in Korea. And then also I think there's something very specific about the fact that Korean political protest grew up and around through dictatorship, through the Joseon period and through the occupation period, where it would have been dangerous and even deadly to participate in public protest. So I think that these factors, the patriotism, the truth, and the justice, matter even more. So it's not just that they spur people to protest anywhere, but that they particularly motivated people to protest even when it might result in them passing away or having their families be put into danger or losing their job or something. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Any more questions for Shea?
And just following up with that, thank you both for wonderful presentations. So Shea, I just wanted to add another question. Do you feel like there's something about the political moment in which these films were made that gives them this kind of cast that you talk about, emphasizing this revealing of truth and patriotism? So maybe you can talk a little bit about, the period in which the films were made and how that perspective shapes what they were kind of trying to communicate.
Yes, absolutely. That's a super interesting question. And I actually love that question because I studied at Yonsei for one semester during my time at GW. And while I was there, I actually got to meet the director of 1987, When the Day Comes, which was part of the reason why I was interested in doing this project in the first place. And when I met him, I asked him, like, what made you want to tell this story now? Like, what made it something that you wanted to talk about? And this movie was released and produced in 2017, so right after the Candlelight movements and Park Geun-hye's impeachment. And so he was talking about how he felt that it was important to make that movie at that time to say something about like the importance of truth and the importance of protest and engagement, especially as it sort of mirrored. He felt that it mirrored what had happened in 1987 and what he had just seen on the streets of Seoul that year. So I do think that things end up getting made to reflect the present day too, which I think is a really interesting aspect of cinema. And that's a strong example because it came from the director himself, that he did feel that it was an important time to tell the story, particularly because of the political moment in Korea at the time.